I'm speaking with Micheál O'Connor from Kilovoltra, and he's going to go back over an exciting and eventful life over the last 8 years. Michael, you're very welcome to our programme.
Thank you very much.
Michael, you grew up in the terrible years after the Civil War, and there was a lot of destruction done and the rest of it. But people settled down quickly, do you think?
They did. I was born just after the Civil War ended, and my heroes growing up were the members of the old IRA. I knew, I suppose, in over a long life, I probably knew hundreds of them, men who had divided on the treaty. But one thing I will say about all of them, without exception, they were people of exemplary character. And even though most of them had only a primary school education, they were all able to differentiate between the ordinary, decent English people and the English establishment. They had that great intelligence in them. And I never knew one of that member of the old IRA, no matter how humble their circumstances in life, every one of them had a big funeral. They were deeply and deeply respected.
During those years, as you were growing up into your teens, can you remember, say, the highlights of that time? Some things that stood out in your mind as, God, this was unusual.
Possibly the first distinct memory I have is walking with my mother of a fine Sunday afternoon, the 2 miles from our house to Paddy Kinney's house in Arnacrusha. Paddy was a lorry driver with Clonderhead Co-op. He was attending the night classes in the vocational school, and at that time there was an engineering teacher there, I think his name was Mr. Cotter, who was deeply interested in electronics, and they rigged up a radio set, and Paddy Kinney brought that set to Arnacrusha, and he has the distinction of having the first radio set in the parish of Clonderhead. But I remember walking with my mother to listen to the Eucharistic Congress in 1932. And when we arrived, the house was packed and a huge crowd outside on the road. And I can remember distinctly John McCormick singing the Panis Angelicus in the Phoenix Park on that day. That was one of the highlights that I can distinctly remember. Another thing that sticks in my mind, at that time, my father and mother always went to last Mass in Macroom, and after Mass I can remember the great Blue Shirt rally in Macroom in 1934, and to my young eyes it was a very, very impressive sight with the lorry loads of people and bus loads arriving in their blue shirts. It's a memory that I can distinctly remember, you know.
Yes, you would have been about 9 years
About
of
9
age
years, yeah. I can vividly remember it, you know. It was
Yeah.
a very impressive sight to my young eyes, you know.
Yes, yes.
Of course, then in 34 we had the Silver Jubilee of the GA, great interest. Newspapers brought out supplements. The Irish Press wasn't long in existence at that time, and it gave great publicity to the GA, and the other newspapers then had to follow suit. And there was great interest in that year. Incidentally, the football, if I remember correctly, was won by Galway, and the hurling by Limerick with the great Mick Mackey on their team, you know.
Yes. They swept the boards those years.
Oh,
in the
yeah,
30s.
they did. Limerick at that time, they were magic. And Cork struck a lean period, you know, in the 30s after the marathon with Kilkenny in 1931.
That's right.
Even though they had a few great individual players like Michael Brennan and John Quirk and Sean Barrett of Kinsale, that great man from Kinsale. The pitch there is called after him now, I believe. And they had a very lean period until 1939. But before that, another thing that sticks out in my mind, a major event, very, very few, I suppose, remember now, was the air display in Kilvaltra in 1937. At the time, you know, flying was in its infancy, really, because it was only 10 years previously that Charles Lindbergh had flown the Atlantic west to east solo. And there were thousands and thousands of people attended in Cork and Kilvaltra. And one of the things I remember, the planes used to take off right down over our house. And at that time, my mother, like all country women, they're young turkeys. And the young turkeys are very, very sensitive little birds. And in the evening when she went out to collect her flock, they were all after going into rabbit burrows and everywhere. She couldn't find them, you know, the havoc of the planes flying. But it was a major event.
Did they actually land?
Oh, yes.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah, the 3 planes. And the price, they had one kind of a wreck of a plane. It barely was able to take off. Half a crown, 2 and 6 for a flight on that. And they had 2 good planes, 5 shillings for a flight on the good planes.
And what year would you say it was?
1937.
37.
Yes.
Well.
It was a major event. Actually, it led to a fair bit of trouble. Dennis Corcoran was a very, very enlightened, generous man. Incidentally, he played in the old Clondalkin team that reached the final, All-Ireland final in 1980-91. But it led to problems for him afterwards, because when the war started, you see, when we were depending on neutrality, anywhere where those air displays were held, they had to be staked in case the enemy would come in, whether that be the Germans or the British, to prevent planes landing, you know. So it led to a fair bit of trouble for him, you know.
So they ruined the field more or less.
Yes, you know. Yes, indeed.
Building pillars or whatever.
Big, huge stakes, you know.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
But Dennis Corcoran was a very, very fine man. Lord mercy.
Did the outbreak of war that year, then 39, did that make a big impact on the community?
Huge.
Yeah.
Huge.
Was there fear?
There was. That's another day that I can remember quite vividly, the 3rd of September 1939. And at 11 o'clock that morning, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, broadcast to his people and stated that they were at war with Germany. And that very same afternoon, the All-Ireland final was being played in Croke Park, Cork and Kilkenny. And it was Cork's first appearance in the final since 1931. The interest was intense. And curiously enough, it was a beautiful evening down here in the south, but all hell broke loose in Croke Park of thunder and lightning, and I can remember well listening to the radio down at Shays in Kilvaltra. Radios were very scarce at that time, and people used to gather at neighbours' houses. And Michael O'Hare used to say it was his first broadcast of an All-Ireland hurling final. And he used to shout, "There goes another flash of lightning." It was a great game, and eventually Kilkenny won it. Usually Kilkenny beat Cork by a point, and they did it this time as well. It was a ball that was batted down. Afterwards, Jack Lynch used to tell that it was a 70 for Kilkenny, and the ball was landing in, and he shouted, Sean Barrett was behind him, and Jack shouted, "I'll go for that." But Jack batted the ball, Jack Barrett, and Jimmy Kelly was the man. He got the ball and put it over the bar, and Kilkenny won the match.
Yes. There was actually 10 years lapse there between 31 and the next All-Ireland Cork one, and you notice that happens a couple of times in our lifetime.
It has happened.
Those 10 years that
yes, it has happened.
They hadn't to break through.
But to finish about the 3rd of September, what a historic, eventful day it was. Of course, everyone then waited with bated breath for what was Dev going to do. And all the radio sets were tuned in that Sunday night when he broadcast to the nation. He said, Ireland, he said, will remain neutral. And there was great sense of relief and pride, you know, that it was the clear proof that we were a sovereign state when we were able to announce to the world that we'd keep out of that war, you know. And about the emergency, then I'm sure you would like to know my views on it, possibly. The hardships were intense.
Yeah.
Everything was scarce. I can remember Sean Lemass, as Minister for Supplies, making an announcement at one stage that the ration would be 2 ounces of tea per person per week. And 4 days afterwards, he had to come back and contradict it and say it will be only a half an ounce per person per week. At the time, we used to get our tea from the London tea market, the Mincing Lane it was known as. And Churchill had decided to put on the squeeze. This would have been about, I'd say, roughly around 1942. Churchill had decided to put on the squeeze. But it is said anyway that Lemass privately promised himself that after the war he'd never again buy a pound of tea in the London market, and the first thing he did after the war was to set up Tea Importers Limited, you know.
Oh, yes.
To buy the tea directly and sail on and bring it in.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And of course we had gone into tea drinking at a terrific rate.
Yes.
In the first 25 years of the last century.
We had. But everything was scarce, of course, in the country districts. Like electricity was unheard of. Mm-hmm. It was the lamp hanging in the wall in the kitchen, mm-hmm. and the paraffin lit with paraffin, and paraffin became painfully scarce. So in many cases, people then had to fall back on candles, and even candles became scarce. Mm-hmm. And needless to say, no one had a light going to bed. Yes. But in spite of all that, and things were tough and very tough, there was a great spirit in the country. People of all political persuasions joined the defence forces to defend the country, regardless of who'd attack it. I always maintained that the emergency years with the GA were primarily responsible for ending the bitterness of the Civil War, because it has ended. Some people say it has not. It has ended long, long ago. Yes. People are now able to discuss it in a fair and balanced way, and to see the rights and the wrongs on both sides, and to regard the people on both sides as really great men who were caught up in a very emotional situation.
Now, you were speaking there about the emergency, as we call those war years.
Yes.
You know, how conditions were. But, you know, the change that has happened since you were a young boy in Kilovoltra, the changes that have happened, say, in living conditions, you know, washing clothes, heating a house. What do you think?
Oh, sure, it's like living in a different world. Mm-hmm. Rural electrification changed everything. Mm-hmm. I often wonder, you know, the Irish people, they don't thank their women folk half enough. The way women had to work in the old days. And families were large, where every garment had to be washed in a tub. Mm-hmm. The baking of the cakes then was a kind of a major operation of heating the cover and the bastable and putting the cakes, and where there were big families, there were a lot of cakes required. And as well as that, they helped out on the land, they milked the cows. Women really worked hard, you know. It was,
oh, absolutely.
It was the women of Ireland, I think we owe an awful lot to them.
They bore the brunt, you know, of rearing children and the whole economy.
The whole economy,
yeah.
They did. And also, during the War of Independence, they don't get the credit they deserve. I mean, the men were out, I mean, the flying columns were out, but the women were at home, bearing the brunt of the raids and all, and in some cases getting news maybe that their loved one had been killed, you know. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, many of the women took an active part. They were wonderful people.
getting into, say, the political figures now of your time, your teen years especially, when elections were, you know, taken very seriously in the 30s, in 32, and right down through the 40s. Who do you think were the outstanding figures of that time?
Well, of course, Collins was before my time, but I would say, you know, that any fair person looking over the past 90 years, there are two giants. That's Collins and De Valera. Mm-hmm. And I suppose there's no doubt Collins was the architect of the intelligence apparatus, and for the first time an Irishman devised a system to beat the British spy system in this country. And until that was done, Ireland had never had any chance. All the risings back along were betrayed by spies and informers until 1916. Mm-hmm. 1916 was the first rising to catch the British unawares, thanks to the secrecy of the IRB. But as the War of Independence went on, Collins became the architect of the espionage system, and he beat the Brits at their own game. Mm-hmm. And talking about that period, I know I'm coming around it in a roundabout way. There's one man I think has been sadly neglected. He was one of Collins's right-hand men. In my view, he was one of our greatest Irishmen. That's Eamon Bry, who was one of Collins's spy in the castles. Uh-huh. Afterwards, he joined the Garda Síochána. Then, at a very vital time in our history, when there was a change of government, and for some reason, historians are divided on this one, General Owen O'Duffy was removed as Commissioner of the Garda Síochána, and the thing was very, very dicey. You had a new government. After all, the people in government were the people who had been defeated in the Civil War 9 years previously. And the Garda Síochána, it was vital that they stay stable. And Eamon Bry stood into the breach, and he did just that. And I'm amazed that no one has written a biography of that great man. He was a Kildare man, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
I didn't answer your question directly, did I?
Well, the thing about it is everyone, I suppose, has his own hero in that. My particular hero would be an engineer that joined Siemens Schuckert in Germany, and he was involved in building hydroelectric schemes in Switzerland, and he sent back a plan to the government in 1922-23.
Yes.
And he was actually the man in charge of the ESB from the beginning. Dr. McLaughlin was his name.
Yes, I've heard of him indeed, yes.
I thought he was a fantastic man. He was only a young fellow when he put that together.
Absolutely. But I'm glad you mentioned it now, you know.
Yeah, because I suppose it has made the greatest contribution to the Celtic Tiger.
Oh,
really.
Absolutely, yeah. It has indeed, yeah. It has indeed.
Now, what about, say, the attitude of people? Say, would you think that people in your young days, say when you were 10 years of age, now in the 30s, were more neighbourly, were more cooperative with one another? They helped one another at the corn, at the hay, at the threshing, a kind of, actions that are not necessary today, really, and for that reason, have we gone into our shells as a people?
Unfortunately, we have, and not intentionally so. The change in lifestyle is responsible. Mm-hmm. When I was a young lad, very, very few people died in hospital. Almost all of them died at home. And for weeks, the neighbours would come in their turn every night to mind those people. And for some reason, death in the home had a deeper impression. It's somehow or another, it would have an indelible impression on you. The coffin being brought down the stairs was a very, very sad moment in the history of any house, you know. But in those days, in those innocent, poor days, we'll call them, practically nobody locked their door. It was a case of pushing the door. But life has so changed because in most cases now, both partners are working. When they come home, they have to see after their children, then into bed, be out at 6 or 7 in the morning. It isn't a choice of people that they're not as neighbourly, it's just that circumstances have made it so, in my opinion. I think there are still as many good people in the country as there ever were. You'll always have the minority who, you know, or the other way, but yes, the vast, vast majority, and the proof of that there is in the response to the tsunami there in recent times.
Ah, yes.
You know,
yes,
the people are really good at heart
yes,
all the time,
yeah,
you know.
People are generous, yeah.
Yeah.
Looking back, say, you worked on the home farm all your life.
Yes.
Yeah, and of course, I suppose, like every farm, my own uncles and the rest, they got very little, what you say, money at the end of the week.
Very little.
Yeah. Can you remember the first time you got a 10-shilling note?
The funny thing about it, I suppose, until I became a teenager, I never handled a 10-shilling note. Really, what were lifesavers for the ordinary farmer's son, or whatever you would like to call them, were the rabbits. The rabbits became
yes,
a major industry.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
During the emergency, I mean, almost everyone had either ferrets, snares, traps, right, and they went at fantastic price as the war went on. I think the skin was needed for munitions for some reason.
Yeah. I think I got £0.50, I think, it was the biggest price I got for rabbits. 2 and 6. Now 2 and 6 at that time was bought 15 Rolos, which is
right,
about the same as €10 today. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
You see, and
a fantastic price.
Yeah, and the 10-shilling note, I asked you about the 10-shilling note especially.
Yeah. Because
when I was a young fella, we had a football team, but we were short a few.
Yes.
It was about 1947, but there was a whole lot of soldiers in Ballincollig, and a man was sent off anyway to get 2 or 3. So we picked up 3 anyway for this game. We played the game and we won the game on the field, but I think there was an objection. But anyway, after the game, they were tugging out on the side of the fence, and the secretary of our club went over to the 3 men and he gave them 10 shillings each. Mm-hmm. Now the 10 shillings that he gave them, the pint of porter was 9 old pence.
Yes.
So they got 13 pints, a packet of Woodbines and 2 boxes of matches.
It gives you the idea of the value of money.
That's right.
Yeah.
The 10-shilling note. But
yeah,
but of course life has so changed. Now, do you think at this stage in your life that you have lived perhaps in the best century since the 1200s?
There's very little doubt about it that it was an amazing century. When you come to think, I was just reading recently a very, very interesting book by Dr. Patrick Welsh, The Rise and Fall of Imperial Ireland. And I'd strongly advise anyone who can get a hold of that book to read it. It describes the events from the Boer War really up to 1916 and the efforts of the old Irish Party under John Redmond to get home rule. And what people should remember is that really home rule only meant that we'd be a county council, we'd be still part of the United Kingdom, and all the major military and treasury powers would be in London. But even that, the effort he put into it and the party put in, and they put their trust in the Liberal Party to get it for them. But to read that book and to see how eventually Redmond and his party were betrayed when England's necessity became the overriding instinct, and how they teamed up with Carson and Craig to outwit Redmond and his party and to betray them. Mm-hmm. But I think at that stage that the 26 counties would be a sovereign independent state. Anyone who would have said it at that time, you'd say, bring on the people with the white coats. Yes. Even to read Padraig Pearse's poem, The Fool, he reminisced about that.
Yes.
It was after that, you know, people forget that Pearse stood in Redmond's platform in 1913, in the Home Rule platform. Mm-hmm. But he gave a warning, if we are betrayed this time, there'll be red blood in Ireland. Yes. It was after that he joined the IRB, and the IRB were already formulating plans for the Rising. And of course, James Connolly's Citizen Army were also. Yes. As a matter of fact, historians sometimes they emphasize that the greatest push came from Pearse. Actually, the greatest push for the Rising came from James Connolly, to such an extent that the IRB were getting nervous of him because that he'd go on his own and spoil the whole thing. And they took him in for a few days to calm him down and to put him, to put the facts before him that there was going to be a rising, and it was just a case of patience.
Now, one of the, in history, you see, everybody has his own viewpoint, naturally enough, you see, in looking at history. And then we get the great scholastic historians, you know. Mm-hmm. And they approach history by saying, like, if only, yes, you know, and we must revise the whole thing. We must revise what actually happened and what should have happened. But the fact of the matter is, no matter what the revisionist historian says, this happened. The event happened. Now, you can't judge people and their motives and the rest of it from a distance of 80 years or more, 90 years. You know.
That is so. And I mean, when I come to think of it, that people talk about a mandate, revolutions rarely, if ever, have an actual mandate from the people, because they have to be planned in secret. And the great thing about 1916 is that for the first time they did keep it secret. I mean, you could argue just as well, was George Washington correct in going and taking on the British in the United States? Yes. Had he a mandate? And would any historian in the United States come up and question Washington? I doubt if they would, and I'd say they'd get very short shrift if they did.
I suppose, Michael, revolutions, all revolutions, they're spontaneous, you know. Some incident ignites the fire. People said this is wrong and we'll do something about it. And then a whole lot of thought maybe goes into a whole lot of the beginning of revolutions. You know?
No, I mean, they just happen, but the remarkable thing, I mean, about the 1916 when, and I'm delighted to learn that there's going to be a state commemoration on next year, the 90th anniversary. And I've always held the view, and I'm chairman of a local committee here in Macroom, I've always held the view that 1916 should not be a political event. 1916 belongs to people of all political persuasions who have a pride in their country and a pride in its past. And as far as possible, party politics should be kept out of it. There were a remarkable body of men who wrote that proclamation. By any standard, that proclamation would stand up with any document that was ever written in history for its nobility and its generosity. And in many ways, it was a document before its time, because it put women on the same level as men. And remember, at the time that those men wrote that document, women had no vote. Women didn't get the vote in 1918, and they had to be over 30 years of age.
That's right.
So they began that proclamation by addressing men and women. Incidentally, it wasn't known until 1990 where that famous document was signed. It was signed at the home of Mr. Wise Power. He was a great GA man. And his wife, Ginny Wise Power, was a remarkable woman in her own right. She was a tremendous worker for the welfare of Republican prisoners. She supported the treaty even though she didn't like it, because she was a very, very great friend and admirer of Arthur Griffith. She was elected then to the Free State Senate, but as the years went on, she became very disillusioned. The Army Mutiny in 24, the Boundary Commission in 25, and when Fianna Fáil was founded in 26, she felt its programme was the type of programme that Collins would have approved, and she joined Fianna Fáil, and she was afterwards elected to the, we'll say, the later Senate. She had the distinction actually of being elected to both Senates for different powers, but she was an amazingly great woman, Ginny Wise Power. You know, but it was there in that house that document was signed.
Now, Michael, we could go on and on and on. We have trawled through 80 years and more of the life of our country. An air display in Kilovoltra, of all things, most amazing. The first radio. Mick Mackey and his Limerick comrades. I saw Mick Mackey playing in his last game, I'd say,
That's
in
interesting.
1946, yeah, Limerick and Tipperary in the Cork Athletic
That's
Grounds.
interesting now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, so many heroes and the changes, the marvellous changes, and of course, it is a great country. There's no doubt about that, you know.
I mean, it is a great country, and I hope we keep it that way.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, Donal.